egész világ sportközvéleményének figyelme London felé fordul ezen a szürke novemberi délutánon. A jobb szélső helyére húzódik. Tibor most befelével laposan, Puskás elhúzza Wright mellett a labdát, ballal lő, gól! Az évszázad mérkőzésén az évszázad legszebb gólja.
In the early 50s, football was not the same thing it is nowadays. Its unrivaled stars were the Hungarian Golden Team, and the brightest one among them was Ferenc Puskás. Rather than overwhelming the opponent like a steamroller, the Hungarian forwards, Puskás, Kocsis, and Hidegkuti, excelled in uniquely delicate moves, bringing tears to their fans' eyes. For contemporary Hungarians, football was more than a game. It gave faith and hope. It was proof that one single person, one single genial dribble can change the world. Or to put it differently, if you have just been deprived of your past and your future is being torn out of your hands, there still remains a sparkling present, a spherical magic, the ball. But let's go step by step. The legendary Hungarian team seemed invincible, but what had seemed absolutely unimaginable took place in Bern on the 4th of July, 1954. Puskás and his companions were defeated in the World Cup final. Germany became world champion and would soon rise from its ashes, perhaps as a result of that victory. In Hungary, thousands of people took to the streets in despair and bitterness. And barely 2 years later, the Hungarians' most cherished player, a master of practical jokes, Puskás, who rarely used his right foot, for the left one was so unmatched, left the country where he had been hailed week after week by masses of people in his mother tongue. For a decade, his name could not even be uttered on Hungarian radio or television. According to a popular contemporary joke, communists were only familiar with 2 of the 4 basic operations of arithmetic: subtraction and division. They subtracted other people's property and then divided it amongst each other. Or, as a Hungarian writer put it, communists want what is good for you, although they want it for themselves. The end of World War II, just as the end of the Great War 27 years before, found Hungary on the losing side. The decision to place Hungary within the Soviet sphere of interest was taken by Stalin and Churchill, who divided the old continent among themselves as early as in October 1944. The German army occupying Hungary and the Hungarian Arrow Cross troops fighting on their side were defeated by the Soviet troops in the winter of 1944-45. When the bloody fighting was over, rather than withdrawing from Hungary, the Red Army incorporated Hungary into the Soviet sphere of influence and then went on imposing the communist regime. Resistance proved pointless. Although the Soviet-backed Communist Party suffered grave defeats in successive free elections, the overwhelming majority of Hungarian voters did not want to live under communism. They had had a taste of it after the First World War. Having gone through the inferno of World War II, people were dreaming of freedom and independence. But the Soviet military command forced the victorious parties to form a coalition with the communists and to place the police force under communist command.
1947. augusztus 31. Magyarország válasz.
As a result, traditional organizations of civil society were dismantled, and ultimately, all political parties were banned, save one. The ill-famed political police was invested with unlimited powers and acted with implacable cruelty. Fear, silence, and mistrust were spreading and ended up invading the lives of families. By the early 50s, terror had grown unbearable. Messianistic believers in equality and workers' power rivaled Dark Age inquisitions in persecuting anyone who represented a threat to their rule. One citizen out of 3 was subject to some sort of official inquiry. Over 400 anti-communist freedom fighters were executed. Political prisoners numbered over 30,000. Scores of people were sent to internment camps and labor camps. As a contemporary joke went, under communism, there were 3 types of citizens: those who had been in jail, those who were in jail, and those who would be in jail.
Soha egy pillanatig nem vesztettem el azt a reményt, hogy a magyar dolgozó nép végül is a szocializmus helyes útjára lép.
The last thing that was advisable was to speak one's opinion out loud. But there was one last place where people could shout as they pleased: the football stadium. That is why being defeated in the World Cup final was so unbearable, as if the very last consolation had evaporated in those years of bitterness. Although, over 1 year before the World Cup, a flicker of hope appeared. The dreaded Generalissimo, the greatest of men, Stalin, was not around anymore. Millions behind the Iron Curtain took a breath of relief when hearing the news of his death. A few months later, in the summer of 1953, workers marched in protest through the streets of East Berlin. Their movement was brutally repressed. But the communist leaders, just like France's Bourbons before them, did not either learn nor forget anything. 1955 brought another turning point. Austria regained her independence and Soviet troops were, for the first time, withdrawn from an occupied country. Expectations ran high. Hungarians were standing by as the endless procession of Soviet tanks was rolling back home through their country. They had been told that Soviet troops only had to be stationed in Hungary in order to ensure the lifeline of their comrades deployed in Austria. But on the eve of the day when Austria regained its freedom and independence, Hungary had to join the Warsaw Pact, which served as a new basis to keep the Soviet troops in Hungary. Hungarians reacted with indescribable disappointment and suppressed anger. Nobody told them that in February 1956, Soviet Communist Party General Secretary Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev unveiled in a secret speech the horrors committed by Stalin. But when, in the summer of 1956, thousands of Poles took to the streets of Poznan, nobody had any doubts any longer. The first cracks had appeared on the walls of the regime. In Hungary, mounting tensions surfaced. At the outset, only in the inter-party debates. Reports on the public mood by the secret police were far from promising. In mid-October 1956, in Szeged, southeastern Hungary, students set up an independent organization, which was then joined by students throughout the country. They organized a march on October 23rd to express their solidarity with Poland. In their helplessness, communist leaders were playing with fire. The demonstration was first banned, then authorized. Their hesitation tore down the dams of fear. In the crowd flooding the streets, people found that they were not alone anymore. By dusk, everyone was out on the streets. A group of demonstrators tore down and started dismembering Stalin's 8-meter-high monument, a symbol of oppression. Only his boots remained in place. The rulers then decided to open fire. Communist police opened fire on unarmed demonstrators first in Debrecen, then in Budapest in front of the public radio building. The demonstration turned into uprising. The uprising turned into revolution. The revolution turned into a war of independence. Most of the freedom fighters facing the Soviet tanks were young workers, students or apprentices. They had revolted against a dictatorship that claimed to rule on their behalf and called its system workers' power. The young revolutionaries, called by the Hungarians the Kids of Budapest, had a few days' taste of freedom only. They felt they had nothing to lose. Many of them could hardly carry their rifles. Students had received military training as part of their curricula in an atmosphere of an official anti-imperialist hysteria. But once they could lay their hands on weapons and live ammunition, they turned them against the Soviet army, inflicting upon it heavy casualties. They were often mere teenagers and were joined by people coming from all walks of life, workers of mature age, soldiers with World War experience, public servants, university students, tough lads of city nightlife. They did not number more than a few thousand, but had the whole of Hungarian society behind them, except for a few groups closely linked to the Communist Party. They were not organized around some well-defined ideology. Their demands were independence, the withdrawal of Soviet troops, the disbanding of the political police, free elections, freedom of conscience, and of religion. The Kids of Budapest shifted the balance of the revolution towards victory. On October 28, 1956, as the Soviet troops had failed to restore order, and as Hungarian soldiers were showing growing solidarity with the freedom fighters, the communist leadership decided to retreat. A ceasefire was declared, and the basic demands of the revolution were accepted. The events of the previous days were described as a national democratic movement. Hungarians felt they had made it. Freedom and independence were at an arm's length. Their hopes were raised further by a declaration by the Soviet government on placing relations with satellite countries, quote, on an equal footing, end quote. But barely 24 hours later, the Kremlin opted for a new military intervention. The Soviet Union felt the loss of prestige resulting from losing Hungary as a member of what was called the socialist camp would be fatal. The Moscow leadership feared a chain reaction and sent fresh troops to Hungary, while talking in public about the withdrawal of the Red Army.
Csapataink harcban állnak. A kormány a helyén van. Ezt közlöm az ország népével és a világ közvéleményével.
The United States of America and Western European Democrats assured the Hungarian Revolution of their sympathy, but no military support was anywhere in sight. The Kids of Budapest had to rely on themselves alone. On November 4th, 1956, 60,000 Red soldiers, almost 2,500 tanks and other armored vehicles, backed by heavy artillery and the Air Force, launched a gigantic offensive to crush the Hungarian Revolution. Such an army would have been capable of subjugating half of Europe. The attackers weren't taking chances. Outside Budapest, Hungarian military units in most cases did not even try to resist the overwhelming superiority in armor and numbers. Planned resistance was not an option, for the Minister of Defense had been lured into arrest with the pretext of negotiations on the withdrawal of the Soviet contingent, while a pro-Soviet government had been set up with János Kádár as Prime Minister. Defying hopelessness, the National Guard, freshly organized from the armed revolutionary groups, as well as some army units, fought back. The fighting erupted mainly in Budapest and a few mining and industrial areas. But the superiority of the attackers was irresistible. By mid-November, even the resistance of the freedom fighters withdrawing from the cities to the mountains was broken. Most of them were killed or captured. The retribution that followed was unprecedented in Hungarian history. By the end of 1969, almost 22,000 people had been condemned to serve shorter or longer terms in jail. 228 freedom fighters had been executed, 14,000 had been interned without a sentence, and 860 deported to the Soviet Union. The victims of the death sentences were in most cases branded as common murderers and thieves, following pre-written scenarios. Their bodies were sunk in unmarked graves. About 200,000 Hungarians fled to the West, most of them young. Ferenc Puskás was just one of them. He failed to return from Vienna and then was banned from visiting his native land for decades. His brilliant career in the West as a player and then as a coach is well known to football fans, but few are aware of how much he suffered from nostalgia. When Laszlo Papp, Hungary's three-time Olympic champion boxer, was involved in a match in Madrid, Puskás paid off the audience to support his old friend. Retribution ended and the ice started melting around 1963, when thousands of prisoners were amnestied and could return to their homes. But in the era named after János Kádár, General Secretary of the Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party, people were not allowed to speak about the revolution. The official historians of the regime described the revolutionaries as fascist mobs, while the revolution itself was characterized as a reactionary counter-revolution. The freshly released prisoners, and often their children, became stigmatized for decades. The kids of Budapest who escaped the gallows could not continue their studies once released from jail. The freedom fighters of October 1956 were subjected to regular harassment by the police. And still, the Hungarian version of communism was nicknamed Goulash Communism, and Hungary was called the most pleasant barrack of the socialist camp. The communist leaders could never forget the icy fear they felt in October 1956. They were afraid of the people, but that fear was mutual. Society was also afraid of them. The deal was a simple one. You won't care about politics and keep silent, while we won't interfere with your private lives and will guarantee you subsistence, even if at the price of indebting this country. More and more people could buy their Trabant and Lada cars, a small country house near Lake Balaton, with a cauldron in the garden and some goulash in the cauldron. Meanwhile, over 60,000 Soviet troops were still being stationed in Hungary. They were the main bulwark of the regime. After the tiring hopelessness of the 70s, something started changing. In 1978, a Polish cardinal named Karol Wojtyła became the Bishop of Rome and head of the Universal Catholic Church. 2 years later, Ronald Reagan was elected 40th President of the United States of America. While Pope John Paul II spoke about the power of love and a life without fear, President Reagan finally declared what everybody had known behind the Iron Curtain.
The aggressive impulses of an evil empire.
The Soviet Union was an evil empire because it disregarded man and his desire to dispose of his own destiny. Through their Solidarity movement in 1980, Poles gave a new proof of their standing as one of Europe's exceptional nations. Moscow was undecided this time. Rather than endorsing a military intervention, it opted for a state of emergency in Poland. But in the New World, that amounted to pouring oil on fire. Similarly, changes were only further accelerated when Mikhail Gorbachev took over the leadership of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union in 1985. He still believed in the possibility of reforming the communist system, and the peoples of the former Soviet Union owe eternal gratitude to him for his naivety. Attempts at political reforms ended up completely disintegrating the already shaky structures of the Soviet regime. The communist system imploded, the Soviet Union fell into pieces, and its peoples took their destinies into their own hands. Hungarians were the first ones to hammer out a brick from the Berlin Wall, the symbol of the whole era. When the new Hungarian opposition groups organized a pan-European picnic at a border crossing with Austria, hundreds of East German refugees rushed through the border that had been left temporarily open. This time, the new generation of Hungarian communists understood how to respond to the challenge of their time by letting tens of thousands of East Germans through to Austria in September 1989. They practically exploded the Soviet Empire. The collapse of the Berlin Wall on the 9th of November 1989 meant the end of the 45-year-old agreement between Churchill and Stalin on dividing the continent. And when, on October 23, 1989, a Hungarian communist, Mátyás Szűrös, had to proclaim the Third Hungarian Republic on the very anniversary of the revolution, that event in reality marked the ultimate victory of the heroes of 1956. Even if many of them did not live long enough to see that day of liberty, we can now call them by their names. Hundreds of passers-by cast a glance at their photos every day when looking at the wall of the Budapest House of Terror Museum. Many stop for a moment, and some even caress one picture or another. And what about Puskás? The great forward is not one of the martyrs. He lived a full life and earned a great amount of glory for his country. And of course, he ended up back home. In 1991, 1 year after the first free elections, he moved back to Hungary. He would stroll along the streets of Budapest with people stopping him and shaking his hand. What a lucky star he was born under, just like us, who have survived communism or know it only from hearsay. Today, Hungarians live in freedom and independence. They just must take care never to forget what the unforgettable Puskás Ferenc used to say before each match to his fellow players as a captain, and later to his players as a coach. Let's just play our own game.